Hello and welcome to episode 22 of Malcolm Show. So, this week I'm speaking a bit more about ratio-based combinatorial algorithms. Essentially what it boils down to is ratio-based combinatorial algorithms are a very useful application of what could be considered analytical number theory as a mathematical, well, you could also consider it a form of sieve theory. The point is, it's a mathematical technique for figuring out how to categorize people. So once you understand how to categorize people for whatever system you might be operating, let's say for instance generative AI or social media or streaming platforms, streaming services, effectively you start beginning to identify network effects. So for instance, a network effect such as degrees of separation or the small world effect, the same thing with different names really. And the idea is that no matter where you are, you're not that far from anybody else. So the key instantiation from ratios here is that when framed combinatorially, is they permit a mathematician, a computer scientist, a neuroscientist, or just an avid enthusiast, a way to incorporate how people interface with systems. So that's a very general answer, and I will try to make it more specific. The specificity of the answer is based in the idea that if you have imbricating ratios, for instance, you can count those ratios from various sources. So, for instance, if we take a prime sequence of 3 to 2, 5 to 3, 5 to 7, then effectively those prime numbers can become a way of looking at how data streams intersect. So because the combinatorial perspective allows imbrication, when we look at imbrication as a means of converging data streams, we can see that the converging data streams are in some ways, so think of a 5 to 7 can be composed of multiple 5 to 3s. So you could have 3 5 to 3s overlapping, and this is where a diagram would be very helpful, but essentially if you think of, let's see if we can draw this out for you. Pardon me. If we have 7 to 5 as the imbricating end state, then we can have 1 5 to 3, a second 5 to 3, and a third 5 to 3, converging in what effectively becomes a congruent manner. So, hold that for you there. And the idea is that if you take that to be a form of geometry, you could have, let's say, 1, 2, 3 from there, 1, 2, 3, from there, and then 1, 2, 3 from here, becoming this. So there's 3 3s, and they add up to become 1 5. Okay, and that same idea, the 3 5s would add together to become 1 7. And it seems an unconventional arithmetic, if you're looking at it as pure arithmetic. The more, as a pure addition, the more important way to look at it is that the imbrication of the ideas as a conceptual congruence is that, think of it almost as as cogs meshing in a machine. So in the same way that your fingers can intersect, if you've got 5 here and 5 here, they make 110 here, but you can link your fingers together in different ways and have all sorts of different results, is that in a digital system, let's say the ratios that have been assigned to each independent 5 to 3, such as the first might be, let's say, a cognitive idea of an intelligent, let's say for example IQ, just it's a term everybody's familiar with, right? And then the second 5-3 might be associated with an emotional state, so it could be representative of your emotional profile. And then the third 5-3 can be seen as a physical profile. So the first being, let's say, IQ, the second being emotional disposition, and the third being physical features. So the ratios that those are measuring in the first place, they can be instantiated as metrics of who you are as a human being. So it could be that your IQ, when measured linguistically, gets a 5 out of 5, and when measured mathematically gets a 3 out of 5. So that would give us the 5 to 3 ratio in that situation that perhaps a social media service might leverage to optimize the level of advertising for various academic journals, or level of reading from more broad scope literature, whether it be newspapers. Obviously personal interest factors into this, but the difference being is that your natural intelligence as well as your personal interests, those have a relationship. And a great way to think about ratios is descriptions of relationships. So for instance, if the totaling score was on a score of out of 8, what is the proportion, aka the ratio, of preference for, let's say, jiu-jitsu versus wrestling, or boxing versus kickboxing? Very similar ideas, but there is a difference. And in the same sense, you could say, as a continuation, let's say for that first 5 to 3, switching from the cognitive, emotional, physical thing to the martial arts, because it's making more sense to me, so hopefully it makes more sense to you, is if we describe that 5 to 3 1 as the first 5 to 3, as the relationship between jiu-jitsu and wrestling, the second 5 to 3 is the relationship between boxing and kickboxing, and the third 5 to 3 is a relationship between grappling and striking. We can then infer that as they overlap, that helps us form a picture of the second rubric here, which could be the totaling of 12, which I'm going to... And that of 12 might be for something of brands of MMA. For instance, it could be Cage Warriors versus UFC. So if those ideas become more salient let's say from a marketing perspective, then effectively the marketer then gets a better idea of, one, why you're interested in, let's say, I guess combat sports, martial arts, combat sports, however you define the general term. I would say martial arts really. Combat sports tends to score higher when you at certain demographics, because whatever reason gets you interested. So for instance, if you're a jiu-jitsu practitioner, as I am, I prefer jiu-jitsu over wrestling. I still enjoy wrestling, and I train no-gi, which is arguably submission wrestling. I prefer jiu-jitsu because well, we can go into the details of that later. We're staying on topic and focusing on ratio-based combinatorial algorithms. which are at the heart of most recommendation systems. So, if we continue that idea in this specification, then from the comparison of grappling with the comparisons of striking and the comparison of grappling to striking, and then develop that into, for instance, Cage Warriors and UFC, they're both MMA brands. So then it might figure out, okay, well, if we want to advertise a Cage Warriors bout to Malcolm, but we know he's more into jiu-jitsu than he is striking generally, then we know not only to focus on advertising with a grappler, we want to focus on advertising with a jiu-jitsu player. So in the same sense that if I'm watching MMA, the most, let's say, because I'm more familiar with the UFC roster than Cage Warriors, that in this proportion it might be the 7-5 being weighted, the antecedent weighting in favour of UFC. Now part of that might be brand salience, because the resonance of UFC is, let's be honest, quite larger, especially on the global scale. In the UK, Cage Warriors is it's a UK brand, and whilst there is a reasonable feeding channel, there is a reasonable funnel from the UFC, from Cage Warriors to the UFC because of the size of each operation. It is a smaller operation. So if we consider the advertising for UFC, they would now of course there will be a degree of marketing strategy from within the UFC itself. However, if they're offloading some of their direct advertising to, it might be Alphabet, it might be Amazon, it might be Meta, these large digital platforms that are so competent in what they do, they can be effectively be described as social engineering platforms. It becomes, from my perspective, easier to think of these organizations as social engineering platforms rather than advertising platforms. So for a long time people have thought of Google as a search engine before they started learning it's more of an advertising platform. And whilst it's terrific at that, it's important to remember that a huge part of what advertising really is, especially as part of a larger marketing narrative, is behavioural conditioning, which in this context would be more specifically referred to as consumer conditioning. Pardon me. So, consumer conditioning being what it is, it makes sense for customers to be converted from consumers, that the conversion funnel that is part of the recommendation systems of the user interface of digital platforms such as generative AI, social media and streaming services to function in accordance with a ratio-based combinatorial algorithm. Now, how these algorithms work specifically is obviously considered quite a closely guarded secret. That's very, very important for everybody to be, stum about, because trade secret. However, from the academic perspective, it is vital to differentiate the social implications from the scale of these operations. It's important to differentiate the economic ambitions, the political aspirations, and then the social implications. I'm viewing it from the perspective of a pestle analysis, because the economic, political and social listed alphabetically are that way because they're quite inherent to everything that those platforms will do. So whether it's Meta via Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp having a far less impactful marketing potency simply because of the nature of the application. However, accessing people's phone numbers and getting to them via WhatsApp is actually quite useful for many marketers because it manages to bypass many international restrictions that would come with phone numbers. So for instance, if you have the internet connection to use WhatsApp frequently, then you don't necessarily get charged for the call or the text message or however you choose to distribute your marketing message. So, with that in mind, if you then continue thinking about, if we then start thinking about how Facebook and Instagram have a far more visually based interface, and especially, and I want to make this very, very clear, especially how there's a differentiation between audio, image, text and video, again listed alphabetically. It's part of my personal systematization for data encoding. If anybody is interested, please leave a comment. I'll happily speak about it to as much depth as you request. One of those essences is alphabetically listing ideas until pushing them in a more formal sequence that is necessitated by design, because it creates a consistent pattern. So that in itself is an idea of behavioural reinforcement. And as I was saying, with the scope of Meta's advertising platforms, which is kind of what Facebook and Instagram really are. They are absolutely fascinating as, you know, how do you want to describe it? Shall we say cultural phenomenon? So the nature of social media is very hard to describe in anything other than incredible, because it is quite incredible how quickly they've taken over the mainstream narrative, as it were. There's very, very little information on social media that hasn't become what could be considered essential to the mainstream zeitgeist. So the reason I'm deciding to speak about this now is because if we consider ratio-based combinatorial algorithms to be an incredibly potent marketing tool, we have to consider that the technology is not limited to being used as a marketing tool, and that marketing in essence is consumer conditioning. Now, when we think of marketing as consumer conditioning instead of simply a business print concept, we start seeing it far more as far beyond its economic applications. We start understanding that there's political instantiation from this. So the political instantiation from ratio-based combinatorial algorithms is propaganda. At its core would be the simplest instance of it. So for instance, people who study military history, or for instance terrorism, counter-terrorism, sorry, I have a module in my next year coming up called Counter-Terrorism and Terrorism, is with the knowledge of how marketing techniques can massage public interest, is very well demonstrated by the events that happened during the Cambridge Analytica quote-unquote scandal. So essentially Cambridge Analytica were able to leverage Facebook and its marketing services, what they call advertising, but advertising is a branch of marketing, so we'll keep it within the family, as it were. As when you start understanding how Cambridge Analytica managed to leverage Facebook's technologies to essentially commandeer elections. Now, I've seen a documentary, I've done some reading on the matter. I won't profess to be the world's leading expert on this, however it is incredibly pertinent to the topic at hand, is figuring out how exactly can these technologies become effectively not just monetized or politicized, but weaponized. And that's the really important thing to realize here, is that the monetization of these technologies isn't that big a deal, to be quite honest. Everybody sort of expects them to become monetized. It's a commercial application for a business, right? It's not an event, as it were. Now, when we consider the politicalization of these tools, okay, yeah, maybe it's slightly more ethically ambiguous because describing, hello Stephen Joseph one, because the political aspirations of some people don't necessarily align with what can be called the common good. Now, personal political affiliations aside, I don't want to describe anybody specifically as good or bad. I think general morality that can be agreed upon, whether you're looking at it from the modern day rhetoric or philosophical instantiation from the ancient Greeks or the Enlightenment of Germany or Descartes, or I'm trying to think of philosophers I've read and could actually speak a bit about, or you're looking at it from a religious perspective. I'm winning, Stephen Joseph, thank you. However you define morality, essentially it boils down to an ethical code. Now that ethical code, we could argue, is designed designed in mind with the best outcome for as many members of as many contributing members of society as possible. Now I'm sure that word contributing is going to garner more pushback than I might ever hope. However, the principle of the matter, disrespectful checkmate I've ever had. I have got smothered mate a few times before. Don't know if that counts as disrespectful. Yeah, I do quite like checkmating with pawns. It's never meant to be disrespectful. I don't think any checkmate's disrespectful. It's just the point of chess, isn't it? Anyway, as I was saying, so ratio-based combinatorial algorithms in an economic context are somewhat obvious. It's what they're generally designed for, unless you're a pure mathematician just having fun. Politically speaking, they have huge influence, as was seen with Cambridge Analytica, when they it's instantiated that they directly caused both the Brexit campaign success and the results of the 2016 US election. Now, I think it's more important to look at these events as, one, not as unique events of digital gerrymandering as much as the first elucidated event, because from a propaganda perspective it might work very well for, shall we just generally say, the opposition of the UK and the US to frame the public narrative in such a manner, which is where something such as the Cambridge Analytica event provides a really, really useful basis for understanding quite how ratio-based combinatorial algorithms can influence people, which would take us into the idea of social application of ratio-based combinatorial algorithms. My rating, if it's not on the screen. No, so in correspondence chess I have a 1262, in rapid chess I think it's around 1000. Over the board I tend to play the person, so let's just go with -2 and hope it doesn't get worse. Yeah, I enjoy chess. The reason I'm playing at this easier level is so I can think whilst I'm playing. So the reason for this podcast and stream is to help me practice my elocution and enunciation as I start stringing ideas together for my dissertation. So whilst the chess might not be the highest difficulty you've ever seen, hopefully it will serve as some visual stimulus while I speak my mind. Okay, so economic and political applications of ratio-based combinatorial algorithms are somewhat self-explanatory, and I personally think that the social causation that they can do, I think a more fluent way to say that, is I think the social effects that these algorithms can cause is obviously it's immense, to use a very blunt word. It's not just affecting us at an individual level and how we feel about our day-to-day lives. It's anything that these technologies can influence at the individual level simultaneously is affecting us at a population level. It's not just your local community or the city you live in or the country. They're on a planetary scale now. Companies such as Alphabet, Amazon and Meta, as well as, Apple, Android, Microsoft, and I'm sure there's many other companies from non-English speaking countries that are pretty damn effective at what they do. For instance, if I remember correctly, TikTok is a Chinese company that has I think over a billion daily users as well, which is huge, right? Facebook and Instagram also each have over a billion daily users. I think Facebook's is over 2 billion, perhaps more. I know that ChatGPT has over 500 million daily users, and this is where it's really important to start considering how generative AI is somewhat similar, if albeit more nuanced, or perhaps better to say more subtle, than social media. So the difference here being, and I will remain as concentrated as I can as I add in the data, the importance here is noticing precisely how social media algorithms manage to influence economic events as well as political events as well as social discourse. Because if they're able to disrupt a nation's political election, then it's quite easy to substantiate the claim that they can influence your personal relationships with your friends. Anything that Cambridge Analytica can do to a population of, well, in the UK, 60 million people approximately, they can probably do to you and your 6 closest friends in the terms of degrees of separation, right? So I'm going to write down a note. I'll be with you in a minute. What was done to the population can be done to the individual, which I think might be the key takeaway here, is anything that a company such as Cambridge Analytica, and I think it's very important to remember, they are not the only company that provide those services, can be done by many other companies for many other reasons, and whether those be economic or political or social. And I think it's very important to recognise. What's going on there? Oh, I see what I've done. Sorry, I've got a spreadsheet to my side. Oop, oop, oop. Can be done to the individual. So, because anything that these companies can do can be done at the microcosmic scale as well as the macrocosmic scale, it becomes really important to think about, well, what has gone on in your life recently? How much willpower and free will do you actually have? Because if the free will that we're given to believe is all part of living in society regularly, and, trying to keep this about the ideas of the mathematics and marketing, as well as the relevant topic, well, I suppose the philosophy is useful to a degree, is if we argue that the free will we have is increasingly an illusion because of the persuasive ability the technologies have, because a ratio-based combinatorial algorithm effectively can numerify all of you. Everything from, as I was describing at the beginning, your cognitive abilities, whether it be via a summation of IQ or some sort of equivalency and intelligence test, as well as being able to differentiate your self-discipline, your tenacity, your personal interests in the more cognitive and affective range, through to the the emotional ideas of how do you feel when person A says hello to you? How do you feel when person B doesn't say hello to you? How do you feel when person C asks you a question on topic D, etc., etc. These can all be reduced to numerical qualities of did it trigger an effect as a simple Boolean logic, 0 or 1? Was the effect significant enough to cause, let's say, engagement with the stimulus? So let's say you were scrolling through a social media feed, you receive a notification or a message from, well, this is the interesting thing. Let's say you're on a meta product such as Facebook and you receive an Instagram notification or even a WhatsApp notification. It's entirely possible that the timing of, well, let's go to Facebook or Instagram notification first. It's entirely possible that the timings of those notifications, if they're not based on other humans' behavior, is specifically timed when you're scrolling past a specific part of the newsfeed to nudge you and eventually trigger a behavioural response. So sometimes it would be considered behavioural priming. Sometimes I still need to differentiate how nudging and priming are actually different, but I don't think that I would at first define priming as a subset of nudges, and I would argue that nudges could also be categorized in the same way that adverts often are, which would be informative, persuasive, and reminder. The thing I would look at from there is all nudges to some degree are a priming effect, and then the network effect plus priming effect becomes bigger and bigger. So because networking effects and priming effects aren't mutually exclusive, it is entirely possible that the network effect is part of a larger scale priming effect. So the nudges that are done to, if you're unaware of nudge theory, first of all, there was literature about it from 1995 by a fellow called Wilk, who I haven't read much more about, but I know he was one of the beginners of formalizing the theory. More recently, it was developed by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, publicized in a book called Nudge in 2008, and was at least in part cited as the reasoning for Richard Thaler's Nobel Prize in economics. So, and beyond that, the book Nudge was so effective in describing its ideas that the British government then, and I'm fairly sure other governments around the world did the same sort of thing, but the British government specifically founded what was named the Nudge Department. And the idea of a nudge is effectively, it's quite similar to how it sounds. So let's say you're at a music festival, really large crowd, and you're just getting jostled about because it's all the music, but instead of it being some sort of incoherent chaos of physical gyration, it's actually a really, really complex system. So there's dynamic elements, there's static elements. Those mechanics are working together to cause specific effects. Okay. So with this perspective, is when you're online, you're, let's say, at the digital music festival compared to the physical musical festival. So the digital music festival is you're always a few degrees of separation away from everybody else. This would be the small world theory, also known as 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, if anybody is aware of that game. It's also been known as, I found out about it as the Wikipedia game, of wherever you are in Wikipedia, how quickly can you get to another topic. Once you get reasonably good at surfing through it, you find that certain pages have an incredibly diverse set of links on them. And the idea of it is, if you're online, let's say at 6 p.m, generally most people are home. Generally most people who are online at 6 p.m. have been awake since approximately 9 a.m. or earlier. So you could then infer, okay, well, if the population's generally got this much energy, then we want to make sure everybody who's online at this time not only has their personalized news feed showing them pictures of person A and event B and popular media C, then we also want to make sure that the narrative, okay, and this is a really important word, it's not just a narrative in the linguistic idea of forming sentences with clauses and staccatoing the pacing and building up to a crescendo, as you might in music theory. The idea of the narrative, digitally speaking, of the newsfeed is, for instance, the proportion of audio to image to text to video. That forms part of a narrative which your brain interprets in the way the brain interprets. And the simple way to start thinking about this is that narrative then starts becoming a very cogent social engineering tool. It really does, because the way it can influence the individual and the population simultaneously is part of what gives it so much power. And that's precisely what companies such as Cambridge Analytica were doing when they were paid to adjust the results of an election. Now, you can argue till the cows come home that it was unethical or borderline illegal. However, to the best of my knowledge, nothing that Cambridge Analytica did was legal. They certainly got in trouble about it and were taken to court. However, they were using the services provided to them by Facebook. And this is where ratio-based combinatorial algorithms as monetizable, politicizable tools, people don't think too much about it, despite their very long-term effects that they can have. This is where their weaponizable traits become far more salient. Because any tool that can become weaponized can and will be used for whatever purpose the wielder chooses, and that is not necessarily negotiable. So, I'm writing down another note, this time in red ink instead of blue, and it says monetize, politicize, weaponize. Because anything that can be monetized can be politicized and weaponized. Anything that can be politicized can be monetized and weaponized. And for those of you who understand the logic of deduction, anything that can be weaponized can be monetized and politicized. So, well, just in case there's some new political science students or just people who are, learning for the first time. Let's not be rude about it. Everybody learn. Everything you've ever learned, you learned for the first time. You either learned about it the first time or you're being reminded about it, so let's not be cruel. Anyway, the point of the matter is if they can be weaponized, then, and I would willingly bet my life savings on this, as well as all of yours, that I'm not the first person to recognize the military applications of ratio-based combinatorial algorithms. So, without diverting too far from the attempt at academic tone, let's stay on topic and recognize that if the military applications of these mathematical tools is, let's be fair, recognizable, and people are deliberately paid to identify tools such as these, either from developing science or technology-based businesses, either within or from outwith the military, then it's very improbable that it was discovered at 7 p.m. on the 17th of June 2025. It was more probably discovered several years ago. So, without knowing specifically which dates these were developed, we do know that Facebook was made publicly available after, I think it was in 2007, which was also part of the remnants of a DARPA project called LifeLog, as Siri was also part of remnants of a DARPA project, so you can look those up for yourself. So the knowledge of how influential the technology such as Facebook could be was around for a very, very long time. And I would imagine that by the time those businesses really started, because there was a period of time where Facebook was known, then there was it when Facebook became, oh, it's becoming a thing, and then it became Facebook. It became one of those things where it was almost weirder not to have a Facebook, and it happened faster than most people. It felt like it happened slower than it actually did, simply because you heard it mentioned so many times that just because of how interesting it was. There wasn't really anything preceding Facebook. I remember being a teenager in one of my best friend's bedroom, shout out James Hutt if you're listening, and he was literally, I remember, he was ahead of the curve. He showed me, have you seen this? Facebook's really cool. It's like, I don't really get it, but I trust you, make me an account, we'll see what happens. And he was right. And yeah, fast forward however many years to now, and we see that it is becoming almost essential in some businesses. If you want to market yourself to a larger audience, technologies such as the social media platforms that Meta offers, Facebook and Instagram, as well as Alphabet has Google and YouTube, then you can get into all the other possible competitors, as well as Amazon advertising, and it's huge. These technologies are absolutely massive. Okay, so staying the course, it's very important to recognise that whilst these technologies have developed enormously since their inception, they're not without limitation. So I was reading a paper recently named Influence and Decision Making of Nudges on Professionals, or something to that effect. Let's double check the data. Influence of and resistance to nudge decision making in professionals. Okay, so as that paper was describing, is that nudges can be very, very effective. However, they don't necessarily work without supporting materials. They also don't necessarily work if you're quite good at resisting them, for instance. So whilst it is very easy for us to use emotionally charged language and try to demonize companies such as Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and Instagram and all these other, and Google and all these other companies, at the same time there is a certain degree of human agency that must be accepted. Are you being influenced so effectively that it is akin with consumer conditioning? Well, it is consumer conditioning. Is it to such an effective degree that you could call it, and here's the more emotionally charged terms of brainwashing or mind control? Because effectively, if you took someone from a vulnerable part of the population and sat them in front of those screens all day long and didn't give them many alternative news sources, they'd start taking a lot of what they saw at face value. And I don't want to make any assumptions about vulnerable members of the population. What I'm trying to say is they're described as vulnerable members of the population for a reason, because they are vulnerable. And vulnerable, for anybody who's unaware, means that they're more susceptible to attack, I think in the context, drives my point home without being overly fanatic. I feel it's really important to recognise that for instance, let's go slightly tangential, think about it from the perspective of something such as 4chan, okay? So whether you're on 4chan or Reddit or any of these sort of mainstream forums, news boards, whatever you want to call them, they radicalise people. So does Facebook, so does Instagram, so does YouTube. They all radicalise people. The thing is, the term radicalise is often falsely equated to meaning, and this is the tricky part, because let's go to some sort of right-wing ideology. but a radicalization is not exclusive to any ideological norm, and I'm not going to support or disavow any political allegiance as long as I can. I'm just trying to study effectively, okay? Pardon me. The idea that I'm trying to get forward is that if you can be radicalized one way, you can be radicalized the other way. And just because there are two leading narratives of political infrastructure does not mean they're the only potential political opportunities. Pardon me. So, as I was saying, when you start thinking about whether or not the political parties at hand are able to finance digital marketing campaigns that can influence people, the important thing to remember is that not only are they changing economic behaviours because of the displacement of financially based business advertising, I should say, through the placement of political advertising, is they're also affecting the social landscape, because whilst politically speaking they might disrupt the natural course of elections, who's to say that isn't a fair tactic as part of a greater strategy? Simply because a company such as Cambridge Analytica can pay a company such as Facebook, and let's remember, it won't be just Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Snapchat, TikTok, they'll all have, all of them, I don't know if Snapchat specifically has advertising qualities to it, but I know that Instagram, TikTok and YouTube do. That means all three of those companies can be paid to by political activists to support their chosen cause, which then means they can be, their platforms of radicalization. Now, that's a very strong way to describe what is essentially meant to be an entertainment conduit. However, the principle at hand is they're all competently capable of the same thing. So, staying on topic, sorry, I'm energy depletion, so trying to stay focused, still use a strong vocabulary, cohesively piece everything together. Sipping water won't hurt you, Malcolm. He said, taking 3 gulps. Anyway, as I was saying before, the implications of ratio-based combinatorial algorithms from the microcosmic up through the macrocosmic scale is something that, when you think about it politically and in terms of radicalization, you can start thinking that the individual might be radicalized to, let's just say, from A to B, and not want to go back to A. In fact, they might even want to go further to C, and it's actually something that, because the mainstream narrative was neither A or B or C or whatever, they just found their people, as it were. And in that, with that phrasing, the idea feels very palatable, it feels very approachable. The tricky thing is then, it's like, okay, well, is that direction of radicalization acceptable to mainstream society? And, you know, there's some forms of ideology that I probably disagree enough with that I could demonize and be happy, and I'm sure we could name certain historical events and, well, let's not get into mudslinging. It's just, I don't want to criticize anybody specifically. I'd rather try and remain as technical and academically, have the academic integrity all the way through and focus on the concepts rather than factions. So, fact of the matter is radicalization can go from either direction. It can go from left to right, right to left. It could go from down to up. You could be radicalized to want to be rich. You could be a rich person radicalized to wanting to be poor. Not quite sure how quickly you can make that happen, but I don't doubt that these technologies can do that. That's the level that I feel is generally accepted in the population. It's just becoming more broadly accepted in the academic sphere. And that's what's really fascinating me, is why I find writing about this stuff so interesting, is because it's becoming more and more academically acceptable to discuss these tools as genuine threats to democracy, to quote a very, shall we say, haunting set of... I remember seeing a video compilation where there was a good 40, 50 plus news stations all saying this is a threat to our democracy in such tonal unison that it just, if it wasn't scripted, it bloody well looked like it. Anyway, the point I'm making is that if the academic community can take these technologies seriously enough to see them as a potential threat to free will, which I feel is, a more fair way of saying, I feel is a more neutral way of saying this, then we have to accept that, well, what is free will? Did we ever have free will? Because before these technologies came around, we might have argued to ourselves that, yeah, I've got free will, I make all my own decisions. Okay, we're still making decisions within a system, whether you describe it as the economy, or a society, or a theory of everything, whether that be from classical mechanics, quantum mechanics, simulation theory, or something else altogether, such as geometric field theory, or whatever Roger Penrose's was. I think it's OOR is the acronym. Pardon me, sorry, when I speak for extended periods without interruption, I'm getting better at it. Okay, so, the point I was making is, if the economic and political implications of such mathematics are evidently salient in the business context and the political context, then it's also very reasonable to infer, you can instantiate actually, that they're effective in a military context, which also means that the social implications I was mentioning are obvious, which means culture then becomes algorithmically definable. So if culture becomes algorithmically definable, then effectively everything we're doing is part of a greater algorithm, and if everything's part of a greater algorithm, then we have to consider that the lives we live aren't anywhere near as natural as we might imagine. So, I'm going to continue. This is the part of the show where... Sorry, I've got an Eminem song in my head now. This is the part where this is the thing, is... Okay, as I was about to say, I'm going to start speaking... This one I'm happy with how academically I've spoken through this. I want to continue speaking because my aim was to do at least 2 games per match. I know generally I was aiming to do an hour, but with this new format through summer, I'm just going to play at least 2 solid games and see how long it takes. But the idea for this follow-up match is because I want to explore this from a less academic tone and just explore my ideas in what I would describe a less formal presentation, yet still has validity because of the concepts being described. So, as I'm sure all of you can agree and attest to some degree, speaking in an academic tone with such a vocabulary that requires, 61 multisyllabic words per minute, it is quite gratifying to then speak at a more comfortable tone. Now, I'm still going to be focusing on developing my vernacular relative to the topic and having a reasonably strong vocabulary. I'm also going to explore the idea with a slightly more casual approach. So, I had an idea in my head. Right, so the idea in my head, generally speaking, is because ratio-based combinatorial algorithms have such a potency as a social conditioning tool, effectively we already live in something that I would describe as comparable with simulation or the singularity. Now, whilst this is something I plan to publish eventually, perhaps more personally than professionally, but keep going with it. The idea is, on a long enough time frame, the singularity is something that we as a population enter, right? So if we on a long enough time frame enter a simulation via the singularity, if I got all my words the correct way around there, I've been awake since like 5:45s, and it's 7:15 now, so that is 12 and a half hours, 13 and a half hours. Plus, jiu-jitsu first thing, gotta get the exercise in. See, this is the informal tone I was trying to avoid. There's informal and there's informal, and I'm trying to, bump my informal up to be more formal, so then I can actually use this material in future. Right, that's that done. On to round 2, electric boogaloo. Okay, so the idea I was describing can be effectively summarized as the singularity being... I need to figure out what a mathematical singularity is, because I hear that phrase frequently enough, so I want to differentiate it. So, the idea of a not computational singularity, a technological singularity? Yeah, where biology and technology meet is the idea is presented by Kurzweil in Singularities Near, is something that I feel has substantial collinearity with the direction of technology's development. So whilst I was speaking about present day implementation and application of ratio-based combinatorial algorithms during the previous game, in this section I'm speaking more about not just the philosophical ideas of it, but more to do with, I guess, nearly the metaphysical implications of it, or I mean, I can go all the way into the ontological if you really want me to. I've got theories for days on this. The point I was going to make is, because the singularity seems to be more of an eventuality than a possibility, then we have to accept that maybe simulation theory is as much a possibility. Maybe it's more of an eventuality than it's a possibility, is the point I'm trying to make here. So, because simulation theory might be more of an eventuality than a possibility, it makes sense to start reasoning that the singularity and the simulation, I really hope I'm saying these in the right order around, hopefully you understand the concept I'm flowing with, is sort of two wings of the same bird. So, because we're going to be economically driven to develop more and more of the technologies that have, shall we say, given us great prosperity, because, well, linking people throughout the world is quite useful for the development of the species. It's also, let's just say the bishop, very helpful in political terms for helping people communicate in a way out with the traditional barriers, because traditionally speaking a lot of political discourse happened via classical outputs such as broadcast television. So for instance, when people were on a debate, let's say you had what's the term? The sitting president's political party, the incumbent. Whenever you had the party who was winning the election at the time, as well as the leader of the opposition, let's say you have the two leaders of the dominant two parties, whenever they had a debate online, they were having a debate that wasn't necessarily organically occurring. What they were doing was following a script that each political party's script writers had written. Very similar to how marketers will write copy that develops a brand narrative, as well as shaping the brand identity into what is requested of them by either the company's founders, owners, or executive board. So because that brand identity is a tool for the company to leverage, it's a resource, then by that same principle, which we can infer from the political science perspective, that pawn's hanging, wasn't it? Yep. Oh, that's fine. Okay, so because we can continuously infer the idea that a marketing campaign is in essence a political campaign with a different overall objective, even though you could argue that winning market share is akin to winning a voter base. We then have to wonder what is the economic equivalency of gerrymandering, because if if a political party can digitally gerrymander the online space to rig an election, then by the same virtue, a business can gerrymander the online space to rig the market. If you have sufficiently intelligent marketing agents who are familiar enough with the recommendation system, the algorithm, or the phrasing, the algorithm of a company such as Alphabet or Amazon or Meta, or their various subsidiary companies, then it's not at all unreasonable to infer that the economic landscape that we're participating in isn't actually as organically occurring as it might seem. Now, the continuation from this, it's not just from my perspective, it's, thank you, Vizobi, is what if the businesses that are ahead of them, their various markets, aren't the businesses that are supposed to be there? What if they were, pardon me, the consequences of the previous era, and they'd only managed to continue their relative dominance because they had the resources during the switch? So this is where I start using some acronyms. So, the principle I'm going to start speaking about is it's called dead internet theory, and I feel that it's become sufficiently salient in academic context to be a conduit for describing the development of the digital world. Now, the digital world has come on in leaps and bounds with such a degree of relative sophistication that everything they do has a consequence on the world. Okay, tautologically, absolutely correct. So, the point I want to make next is that companies that have sufficient resources to influence at the planetary scale also will make use of digital technologies such as, the clinical term I've heard is bot farms. So, bot farms, as I need to write that down. Because I remember hearing from the Joe Rogan podcast, who did cite their source, and I have heard in other places as well, that during a period of time not far from those elections, there were, I think it was 19 out of the top 20 Christian Facebook pages were operated by Russian bot farms. Now, whether that in itself is some sort of false flag operation of a deeper psychological operation from, I don't know, maybe it was China, maybe it was Israel, maybe it was Germany, maybe it was Norway, who knows. The point stands is, without trying to infer anybody's culpability for that specific attack, the point of the matter is a nation had managed to infiltrate a seemingly a nation had managed to sufficiently infiltrate a religious system to the effect that it was controlling the narrative, because if you control 19 out of 20 of the top 20, then you probably have a significant influence over that narrative of that group's narrative. Okay, so with that in mind, as I was saying before, of dead internet theory, the idea with dead internet theory in the modern day is something that I first heard from the original theories. Well, the original post described it as the inversion, as the moment where it's been attributed to Google engineers nowadays, but I want to make it clear that I heard about the term before it was attributed to Google engineers. And it's not me trying to be a hipster, that's me noticing the different accreditation of the term for the phenomena, because it happened on a WizardChan forum years ago, way before Google engineers were given credit for the claim. The original Dead Internet post is very old, so I'm pretty sure I could find it somewhere if I looked for it. There's actually quite a few posts on it. It's in one of my YouTube playlists. It's either in one of my YouTube playlists, or you can search Dead Internet Theory on YouTube and you can find it. The point I'm making is the inversion is descriptive of an event where the amount of internet traffic is majority bots, aka majority not human, aka the majority is not organically occurring. So this then means that all the resulting trends that human beings feel are going on in the world aren't organic. They're actually the results of organizations with specific agendas. Now, they might be economically driven, they might be politically driven, they might be socially driven. The point of the matter is they specifically have an interest in changing the mainstream narrative. And their objective in changing the mainstream narrative is to, well, it might be to destabilize a country, it might be to destabilize the economy, not just an economy. It might be to cause enough problems that it amuses them. There's so many different possibilities to the reasoning here. It's very important to remember that just because it seems improbable doesn't mean it is impossible. And I really wish there's a simpler way to say that, is the amount of bots online has grown to a point where dead internet theory is now being taken very seriously by some very credible people. And if something such as dead internet theory can be taken seriously by some very credible people, then it stands to reason that it was worth taking seriously before it was publicly known that the serious people were taking it seriously. So if the serious people are taking it serious now, then why weren't we listening when they said it the first time? Is that a consequence of something such as dead internet theory and the politics of the world interfering with, shall we say, the news, for a very general term? The point I'm trying to make is ratio-based combinatorial algorithms are written by humans, but they're implemented by machines. And a machine doesn't need to drink water, it doesn't need to eat food, it doesn't need to go to sleep, it doesn't need to go to the bathroom, it doesn't need to socialize. It literally just works for as long as it's told to work until its power source is cut off, whether that being switched off or destroyed or whatever. They just keep going, which means no matter how hard humans might try to counter it, they have to be countered with other machines. And then that's when the issue becomes akin to the idea of an arms race. This is why I was saying monetization, politicization, and weaponization earlier, because it's really, really important to differentiate the three without forgetting that they are corners of the same triangle. So if we then consider he said is academically professional. Boom, boom, boom. Putting in stats. Is that to some degree, whoever's got the best bot farm wins, which means the dominant culture will then be influenced by the people using the dominant bot farms, aka the dominant computers, aka the dominant machines. So whatever the dominant machine does to implement its algorithms, whether they be ratio-based combinatorial algorithms or a variation thereof, or something completely different to do with, it would be based on behavioural economics to some degree, is what is free will in a world where we're being outsmarted. And I genuinely apologise. I didn't think I'd be as fatigued as I am whilst doing this. However, we shall persevere in principle and say that, okay, if it is, there's a lot of upsides to it, because if you, instead of focusing on, cyber terrorism or political gerrymandering or the technological inversion of humanity becoming a digital species, there's lots of upsides to it. So for instance, it will provide a lot of convenience for a lot of people. It will make life far more comfortable in many ways that it hadn't before. It also theoretically will make the world far more peaceful. And it's something to remember that even though the world has arguably seemed scarier in the past decade or two because of digital technologies giving you the news on this country and that country's negative events on the hour, every hour, regardless of whether or not you ask for them, it's also actually way more peaceful. There's fewer wars, there's generally better peace talks going on, and whilst there are conflicts going on in the world right now, compared to 100 years ago, it is on average far more peaceful. So whilst we can't directly assume the correlation of technological advancement and peace is completely causal, yep. It is, entirely reasonable to think of the good stuff to do with technological advancement. So it's like AI. Now we're dropping to informal. AI is cool. I enjoy having something that can so readily answer so many of my questions in so thorough a manner. I personally used 7 different AI to evaluate my academic writing to ensure, one, that the critical evaluation of any one of them can be corroborated by the others, and then whatever the most salient critique that is consistent amongst all 7 of them, that's what I focus on. Whatever they compliment best on, it's like, okay, let's do that, really focus on getting that good, and work on the biggest weakness, because if I work on those polar dichotomy, then effectively I can, this is my triangulation, goodness gracious, my apologies. The triangulation effectively presents itself, because if you focus on the best thing you're doing and do it better, and the worst thing you're doing and do that better, then the next time you're reading the thing, it'll point out, you've done this really well, you've improved on this, and then whatever the third quality that isn't related to those first 2, you do that. And then you've got 3 things, and then the next time you do it, you can either not focus on your strength, continue building up your weakness and another weakness, and then solidify your other best strength, and you solidify another triangle, which, you start one triangle, and then that triangle can have this adjacent, you can have another triangle, and then this triangle has the opposite, and you can have another triangle, and you just build and build and build. And they're very structurally sound. And then eventually you have a conceptual tetrahedron, and then if you can see it as a 5-cell, it becomes a 5-cell. And then you start seeing ideas in your head, and you can start visualizing this way, that way, and the other way. And it's just the fun of geometry, is no matter which way you look at language, it's got a geometric principle to it. Every word, every syllable technically can be considered the edge of a shape. So for instance, a 3-syllable word is a triangle. You're forming whatever the neuronal networking going on to fire through the dendrites and synapses to create that connection that reinforces the neuroplasticity of that specific neural tract and its various nuclei is a form of triangulation. It might not be a literal triangulation in that it's only like 3 specific points going on, because there's a lot of brain activity going on at any one point. This is why I say it's good to sometimes speak in informal and formal, because this is the sort of idea that's not necessarily connected to what I was saying earlier, but it's just flowing out of me, and I love talking about this stuff. Like, the linguistics of geometry is just so cool. Basically, language, you're just thinking in shapes to start speaking in shapes. And thinking is just speaking in a different dimension. You're just speaking in your own head. You're still enunciating an interlocution between yourself and a version of yourself that you feel needs to hear what you have to say, or a version of you that has decided it needs to be heard is speaking to the part of you that is willing to listen. And you can, figure that all many different ways that you want to. And yeah, I should have got that pin, shouldn't I? It is a very cool. What's the follow-up? Oh, you wouldn't take that there? Uh-huh. This is, see, know how generative AI is very useful for evaluating literature? And social media is not a terrible tool for evaluating social rubrics. It's as much as the quantification of social behavior becoming, comments, likes and shares is somewhat harrowing. It's not actually that inaccurate. To think about it, you either like on something, you can talk about the thing, and you can show it to a friend. That's what, if you had a book in your hand and say, I like this book, I'm going to talk about this book with you. In fact, here, borrow the book. And then before books, it's the same idea would have gone on. It's like, if we were cavemen, it's like, I've sharpened a spear. I like this spear. And you could talk about it with the other cavemen. It's like, I've got a good spear. Is your spear good? You're like, yeah, it's a pretty good spear. You're like, cool. Do you want to try my spear? The next time I'll try yours. Maybe like, don't know how sophisticated caveman languages, but you get the idea. It's the idea that the rubrics that have developed from social media have caused our society to evolve in a way that it can seem really dystopian, but it's just what happens with human beings. And most of the time when you see people talking about, it's the end of the world, it's generally some sort of polemic or tirade aimed at causing social disharmony, and things aren't actually anywhere nearly as bad as they seem they are. They really aren't. And this is why I'm completely aware of the potential irony. Yes, that would be irony of me as a media person speaking about not watching the media and switching off the news. It's like, I don't even enjoy listening to music that much these days, because so much of it feels like it's recommended in accordance with some sort of political agenda, which is one of the reasons I got really into like cell assembly theory, nudge theory, and I've heard about prospect theory, and I have read Thinking Fast and Slow, and that's probably the best place for me to start thinking about connecting the behavioural economics of my dissertation together. I get really into the mathematics of it because it feels really hard to disprove mathematics is what it is, and therefore it feels far more substantial in its description of stuff. Like, I don't get me wrong, I love psychology. I really, really like psychology. It's very cool. Because stuff like the replication crisis makes it very difficult to argue that psychology can be implemented recursively. And the thing is, like, I've been to therapy. I girlfriend is an associate psychologist. She might not appreciate me saying that out loud, but yeah. I'm very aware of the advantages of psychological principles. They are a great way to look at what, to me, is the macrocosmic equivalent to neuroscience. And neuroscience is in effect a microcosmic equivalency to psychology, or really sociology. The idea of it is that when you look at the digital marketing implications of it all, the fact that consumer neuroscience is able to use technologies such as EEGs and fMRIs and FNIRSs to evaluate brain region behaviour and to find out, for instance, it was the initials are B and M from a study where they found out that the activity in the nucleus accumbens was a better indicator of long-term economic behaviour than the self-reported data from the study's participants, which I think is fascinating, because then it tells us that eventually, as these technologies become more sophisticated, for instance, an FNIRS being integrated with a smartphone, which is a functional near-infrared spectroscopy machine, now they're a very portable device, and the fact of having them directly attached to a smartphone might not happen this time tomorrow. However, it's not impossible for it to happen within the next 20 years, because the technology advances faster and faster, especially with AI getting faster and faster. The engineering is just going to pick up as well, and I wouldn't be surprised if that happens within our lifetime. Plus, you've got brain-computer interfaces becoming a thing, and it just goes on and on and on. And I had a really interesting idea, which I'm going to have to listen back for, that this is exactly why we do the podcast, because then I can just speak my mind and find out cool ideas. Now, we have just about finished today's episode. I hope you have all enjoyed listening. I've certainly enjoyed speaking with you. I feel the rest of my evening is best served by doing some reading and making sure I've summarised my notes well enough and learnt bits and bobs from what I'm speaking. If anybody has any questions, you're more than welcome to leave a comment. If you like the video, obviously like the video. If you want to add it to a playlist or share it with a friend, of course, more than welcome to do that. If you want to subscribe to the channel, sure, why not? Go ahead. I will be doing these every week. The aim is to do them on Mondays and Wednesdays. This week I'll be releasing today's on Tuesday, one more on Wednesday and another on Thursday. And after that, so as far as I'm aware, should be able to consistently maintain the Monday-Wednesday schedule throughout the summer. Once the university starts back up in October, we'll see if the schedule has to change. If it does, I will let you all know. And with that, thank you very much for watching. I hope you all had a wonderful time. You're having a wonderful day, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is. Have a beautiful rest of the day. Time that immaculately. Bye.